It's only a kick, a jump, a block. It's only a serve. It's only a tackle, a run. It's only for the fans. After all, it's only pressure. You got this. Adidas.
With threats to our nation waiting around every corner, adaptability is more important than ever. When conditions change without notice, quick strategic thinking is crucial. And with obstacles consistently impending, determination is essential in overcoming them. It's this willingness, decisiveness, and resilience that sets Marines apart. With our fighting spirit, we don't just fight battles, we win them. Marines are the constant our nation counts on to fight the unknown. And through adaptable problem solving, we do just that. Learn more at Marines.com.
Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here are your co-hosts, Doug Lesmerises and Shehan Jeyarajah. Thanks, you guys, for joining us again. This is going to be our preview show for the national title game, Georgia and Alabama. It's Doug and Shehan. We'll probably do this mostly like we've done our previews for the semifinals. And we have a little bit of an input from our tech subscribers, sort of how they're feeling about the game, Shehan. And you and I on the Tuesday show that's for Apple Podcast subscribers, I would direct anybody there because I thought we had a good discussion about what it means when a championship game is two teams from the same conference who have already played each other. It certainly is different than if you were getting teams from opposite geographic regions who hadn't played each other in 15 years. And man, that kind of stuff is really fun sometimes. Our tech subscribers did say, and again, we know that our tech subscribers maybe still lean a little bit Ohio at times, which is great. But I said, how excited are you, Shehan, for this game on a scale of 1 to 10? Because I can ask people, you know, here's a thing, check the bubble, 1 or 7 or 9 or 10 or whatever. 4.25 on a scale of 1 to 10 was the excitement level. There were twice as many people who said I'm a 1 for this game than people who said they were a 10. Now, if we had a gazillion listeners in Alabama, I'm sure that would be a little bit different. I did, and to try to evaluate this game, it was a little bit like, well, I just played a couple weeks ago. Mostly you're trying to say, how much did we already see? Do you think you're going to see basically another version of that? Or do you just think, oh, no, I kind of throw that game out, which is a little bit of a weird way to evaluate college football. I mean, in the NFL, it happens all the time. But in college, it does affect the evaluation, obviously, does it not?
Yeah, I mean, before the playoff games, this was each of their most recent game. And I think that it played a huge role in people kind of undervaluing Georgia and, and obviously, I think, fairly valuing Alabama. And so it's hard not to see what happened in that game, 41-24, Alabama, of course, in the SEC championship game, impacting in some way how we look at this next game. It's such a weird matchup, right? Because we talked about it on the Tuesday show a little bit. It's like when LSU and Alabama played and rematched in 2011, which is something that doesn't happen very often. The difference was that LSU and Alabama played a very close ball game. So this is kind of a weird situation to be in, where two teams who just played a couple of weeks ago are playing for a national championship, even though one kind of dominated the other.
Right. And then it gets into, well, how much did you really, think that it was a complete domination across the board on every level, or were there a couple little things that sort of happened here and there? I'm a little more on the side of maybe two specific things happened that I think maybe won't happen again this time. And actually, I think the first specific thing led to the second specific thing. And if those two specific things happen again, then I think the result will be the same. But I think there's a decent chance of those two specific things not happening again.
Doug, what's the things?
We'll tell you next week on the College Football Survivor Show. So the first is Jamison Williams dropping / being allowed to drop a stick of dynamite into the middle of the Georgia defense with two gigantic plays with 180 receiving yards, whatever it was, and his speed and ability to get open and Bryce Young's ability to make big plays to him, just completely breaking that game and breaking that defense in a way it hadn't been broken all year. And then that putting pressure on Stetson Bennett, who then made a couple killer mistakes, killer picks, including a pick six. And then that was kind of it. So if Georgia learned, now just because you learned about Jameson Williams doesn't mean you're going to stop Jameson Williams, but they also lost John Mechie in the middle of that game. And then we saw last week against Cincinnati, as we talked about, Alabama just used Jameson Williams as John Mechie. It was more like they lost Jameson Williams. So if that happens again, if Jameson Williams doesn't almost single-handedly destroy the Georgia defense, then I think Georgia has a really good chance. And I think they have to have learned from that, Shehan. And so I don't want to say we got 56 more minutes to do. I don't want to say that's the extent of my evaluation, but I do, while it's not a fluke. He's like the most dangerous player on that offense and maybe the most dangerous receiver in America. I'm not convinced that it's like definitely going to happen again. Is that too simplistic?
I don't think so. I mean, one thing to point out from that last game is that over the course of 16 minutes of game time, from 14-12 in the second quarter through 13-10 in the third quarter, Alabama scored 31 points, right? They go 67-yard pass to Jameson Williams. They go 13-yard pass to John Mechie. They go field goal, 11-yard run by Bryce Young, and then 55-yard pass to Jameson Williams. I don't think they're going to have those explosive plays, right, to the same extent, because like you mentioned, they don't have John Mechie to kind of play off of. The flip side, though, is that I don't think that Alabama struggles against Cincinnati are necessarily proof the other way, right? Like, I don't think that Georgia is going to be able to attack Alabama's passing game the same way that Cincinnati was able to, because I think Cincinnati has a better pass defense. I think that they have better DBs. I think that they, got a more consistent pass rush. But the one thing that I will say is that again, it was such a moment in time, right, for Alabama versus Georgia. That second quarter, things just flipped. And by that point, the game was over. It was one quarter of play. After that, Alabama had a pick six and a field goal. That was it, after that 16-minute period. So it's not like Georgia got dominated for four quarters, it was very much oh my gosh, we let go of the rope and it was over by the end of the second quarter. And so the flip side of that, though, too, is that I think probably the most concerning part to me about that Georgia performance wasn't the defense. I think the defense is going to be okay. I certainly don't expect Alabama to score 41 points again. I don't think that they'll probably clear 30 points. The concerning part to me is that Georgia couldn't really run the ball against this Alabama defense that's only been fine, right? Like, it hasn't been an elite defense for most of the year. They looked really good against Cincinnati, but they were kind of able to push Cincinnati around, and they're not going to be able to do that quite the same way against Georgia. But Georgia only averaged about 3 yards a carry. And if Georgia's only going to average 3 yards a carry and then put the ball in Stetson Bennett's hands 48 times again, I mean, Stetson Bennett had a really, really good semifinal game. But if it's Bryce Young versus Stetson Bennett, I mean, congrats, Bama. Congrats on your championship.
No, I think that's a very good point. We'll start here with sort of the thing that we like, the good part that we like about each team, and that was my good thing for Bama, was its run defense and ability to sort of make Georgia one-dimensional last time, and that you don't necessarily know that will change. I mean, Again, they've got to get the number of passing attempts for Stetson Bennett down. And I do think sort of like the flow of the game, but Georgia had a lead in that game, right? I mean, like the idea of get ahead and try to run it and stay balanced and don't make Bennett do too much. It's like, well, we tried that. And then the Bama came back and Bama'd us. I don't know that that'll change that. One of the things, and we never had a show where we recap the semifinals because, you jump to the next thing. But when we did the semifinal, final preview where we made our picks and we said, hey, which running back is going to have the biggest impact in the semifinals? You were on Brian Robinson for Alabama. You were all over that. So now when you think about the other side of things, as Georgia has a bunch of guys, but as much as Brian Robinson, I think he is not an All-American level back. He's big. He's physical. You can give him a load. When he gets going, it can be very tough to stop him because he's so physical. Georgia has a nice rotation of guys, but they don't have a single guy really like that, or at least a way they use that guy. So I do wonder against a Bama defense that is just almost, again, if they haven't been great all year, does it surprise you that like a Nick Saban defense, when it matters, is going to stop the run? Kind of like, I know he's a DB's coach, but it's like, that's such a Saban thing. I agree with you. That feels like Bama might do that again, which gets you back to, okay, Stetson Bennett, here we go. I don't know what Georgia can game plan to automatically run it a lot better this time.
Yeah, and I think that's a real concern for me, right? Defensively, again, I'm not that concerned that Georgia's going to be better than they were, right? But offensively, I mean, you talk about that stretch where Alabama goes up 31 points, right? The drives go for Georgia, 3-and-out, 3-play touchdown drive. It was an explosive passing play to Ladd McConkey. But then end of half, interception, turnover on downs, pick six. That's the game, right? I mean, it's one thing to say Georgia's defense is going to revert back to the mean, which I think is true. I just don't know about what Georgia's offense is going to do, because the top rusher in that game for Georgia was James Cook, 11 carries, 38 yards. That's not good enough. It's just not good enough, right? I mean, Zamir White, 5-star kid, supposed to be a top 10 running back in this draft, 7 carries, 27 yards, just a total non-factor in this ball game, right? And the flip side is for Georgia, so much of their offense came on the back of Brock Bowers, 10 catches, 139 yards, and a touchdown. I don't think that's going to catch Alabama off by surprise again, right? I mean, so if Alabama is able to cause Brock Bowers any issues at all, what is Georgia's path to moving the ball? And so for the thing that I like for Georgia, because I do want to touch on that, it's certainly their run defense too, right? I mean, they are very physical up the middle. You can't attack them up the middle. In fact, out of Alabama's 115 rushing yards against Georgia in the SEC title game, 40 of them were by Bryce Young, right? And he's not running up the middle. He's taking it to the sides. And so I think that for Georgia, all of the fundamentals of their defense are still there. They didn't suddenly forget how to play defense. And I think that certainly the game against Michigan proved that. So, I think that Georgia just needs to keep being able to funnel things inside, because when they can keep things inside and in front of them, that's when they're at their best.
Yeah. All right, we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, I'll say what I like about Georgia the most in this game. We'll do it next on the College Football Survivor Show.
In case you missed the last College Football Survivor Show.
But I also like the Nick Saban challenge. I think I'm going to the game Monday. If they win, I'll ask at the Tuesday coaches news conference, Nick, you think you're so good? Do you believe you could win a national championship at West Virginia within 5 years? And I see if I can get him to do it. I'll bait him into it. That would be a good thing. Could Nick Saban win a national championship at your school? That's how we divide up all the programs in college football. Piscataway, Nick, the last frontier. Greg Schiano will step aside and be your defensive coordinator. Go win a national title at Rutgers. Could you do it?
Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts for exclusive College Survivor Show bonus episodes.
All right, Doug and Shehan back. I don't want to get too psychological, but I think this to me sets up as much of a psychological difference in a rematch as you could look for, which is in game one, the team that is the historical underdog was the in-game favorite, and Alabama was the historical overdog and the in-game underdog, and that absolutely fueled Bama. It was all Nick Saban talked about after the game. All the rat poison. This time you gave the rat poison to Georgia and all that. And I think Georgia, as much as, again, Georgia is in almost this weird tier of its own when we talk about the tiers of college football, because as we always say, we started this podcast in July with the 4 teams who at that point had taken up 20 of the 28 spots in the history of the college football playoff. And Georgia's not one of them. Georgia's not results-wise at the Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, Oklahoma level. But talent-wise, they are. They've just always had Alabama in their way, and they maybe haven't put it all together. Justin Fields was there and left. Both sides of the ball maybe weren't connected, and they never got over the top, right? They probably should have won a national championship, but they had not been a consistent playoff team. So they're like in this mid-tier, like they're kind of better than everybody else in tier 2, but on the field, like they had not been tier 1. But yet here they were. They were the absolute best team all season, and I don't think they handled it well. And so I hate my thing I hate most in life is like you lose and it's like, oh, losing is the best thing for you. It's like, I get it. You learn lessons. I get it. And sometimes if you win and scrape by, but you have problems, it doesn't force the same kind of change that losing does. I just don't like ever talking about losing as a good thing. In life, I lose all the time. I've learned, I don't know if it's got me any better. I just keep losing and keep learning the lessons and never applying them. But in football, I just think it's a cop-out for like you had a bad Saturday and now it's like, well, oh, it's the best thing that could have happened. It's like, okay, bro, it's fine. It's just okay to say you lost. I'm not saying it was good for Georgia to lose. I'm saying I think Georgia will be in a different headspace for this game, even though they once again are the betting favorite because this initial line right away opened at Bama -1. It's now Georgia -3, but I don't think it's not the same to me, right? It's not even about the betting line. It's the idea that like Georgia was going to cap off this season as a dominant team and Bama was scraping by. I just think you're going to get a better mental version of Georgia, which will allow them to be a better physical version of Georgia. And I am taking that into account in my analysis of the game. And then Nick Saban can play mind games with Kirby Smart for 60 minutes and hold up a trophy after a 28-point win. And I can be like, nope, it happened again. Sorry, it wasn't. It was just, they just psyched him out. I do think this could be as I thought when Michigan beat Ohio State this year, Michigan had to overcome not only on-field things, but mental things. And credit to Michigan for doing it. I think that's true with Georgia, but I think having that loss fresh in their mind will help them maybe. I don't think it'll be a double down. Oh, we can't lose to them again. I think it'll be like, oh, okay, we lost, but now not as many people are going to be like, oh, Georgia's definitely going to beat them, so they have a better chance to be themselves. Am I talking myself? Do I now I sound like a person who is talking himself into an impossibility. It's like, oh, I do. I sound like one of those losing is a good thing guys. You're laughing at me. Can we edit that out? Colin, think about taking out that entire thing, and the edit will just be Doug being like, here's what I think, and then Shehan starts talking because I just talked nonsense for 4 minutes.
Well, let me get this straight. So what you're saying...
No, I don't want to have to explain it again.
Georgia came in to the SEC championship game mentally disadvantaged and then lost by 3 scores, and their takeaway from it is, oh, we can hang with these guys. It's not a big deal. Because for me...
It made sense in my head. Right up until I started talking, it made perfect sense to me.
I think that there is something to the idea that getting a loss out of the way can be a good thing. I just don't think that losing to the team that you're about to play in embarrassing fashion is that, playing your worst game of the season against the team that you've never been able to beat, right? Like this is kind of like I don't think it was a bad thing that Michigan lost to Michigan State. Like certainly they wanted to win that game, but kind of got the pressure off a little bit. But this is more the equivalent of Michigan being like, okay, well, we only lost by 35 points to Ohio State. That's not that big a deal. No, that's a huge deal. That's a huge deal. That is the thing that they were trying to do. And if we're going to get to the thing that I'm worried about for Georgia, it's not schematic, right? It's not personnel. It is that I worry that this team is mentally disadvantaged. And most teams are against Alabama. I want to be clear about that. That's not something that is an indictment of Georgia necessarily. But I mean, the funny thing about it is the more that you kind of cover college football, you're around college football, you really do feel that teams take on the personality of their head coach in a lot of ways. And, so I think that, for example, with Nick Saban, right, you see Alabama teams are tough and detail-oriented and physical, right? They really are good at mixing sort of the physical with the mental of the game. And I think with Georgia, I think that Georgia is determined. I think that Georgia is very aggressive. I think that they're very defensive minded. I think all these things flow from Kirby Smart. I think it's one of the reasons that they're one of the great teams in college football. But I also think that Kirby Smart is very aware of what he has not done against Alabama and what he has not done against Nick Saban. And I think that Kirby Smart is very aware of the fact that the thing keeping him out of the conversation of being among these top echelon of coaches and being seen as that kind of guy is the fact that he hasn't beaten Alabama. And I think that nothing verbal needs to be said by him. He's not having this conversation in the building, right? But I think that you see that on the field too. I think you see that in the way that the players are coached. I think you see that in the way that the players respond to adversity against this Alabama team, or not, right? Like, I think that kind of flows down from the top in some ways. And that's unfair because Kirby Smart does need to win these games to be considered that. And at the beginning of the year, we had this conversation, right? I mean, you had among our playoff contenders, you had Kirby Smart at the bottom of your list. And for me, I was much higher on him because I just feel like not being as good as Alabama is not as big a deal to me as I think it is to other people. But to be in that conversation, to be a consensus top 5, top 3, whatever coach, this is it, right? You got to go. You got to beat Alabama and you got to win the national championship. He can take every monkey off his back on Monday, right? And he will be considered probably consensus, the number 3 coach in college football if he wins that game on Monday. It's a lot of pressure, and I don't know if both he and Georgia are prepared for that.
First of all, I don't like it when you reference things I said in the past. That's not helpful to me. It might be helpful to the listeners, but I don't remember what I said about Kirby Smart in August, but clearly you do. But I guess I don't disagree with the idea of like, what if you were doing maybe you'll do this for CBS Sports, like different categories of an edge, offense, defense, intangibles, coaching. I mean, every single person in the world would give Alabama the edge, but it's also like if you had 10 points to assign to coaching, this isn't like 5.5, 4.5, right? This is like, and this is not any offense to Kirby Smart, but just Saban being Saban, plus the historical psychological part of Kirby Smart having never beaten him. And by the way, Alabama has won 7 straight against Georgia dating back to 2008. Georgia's last win overtime in 2007. I mean, of course, you'd probably be 8-2 or 9-1 in favor of Saban because Saban. This is a test of him, right? I mean, this is a great test because you have to be able to take what just happened, and as Georgia, you have to be able to somehow use that, right? Whether it's motivation, or you're going to let them kick your butt twice in a month, right? Or whatever, or hey, we learned all this stuff from that, or whatever. You have to be able to use it in some way. Can I do another thing that I like about Georgia? I was going to do George Pickens. He only had like 1 target in the last game, though. So I don't know. I actually thought about that. That was like, I've been thinking about this all week, the idea that like, hey, I like where this is. So then let me ask you this before we move on to something. Why is Georgia favored then? Why is Georgia favored? Is just everybody a lunatic knucklehead like me and staring at the thing that just happened, that the best coach ever just did, and being like, oh, no, that won't happen again? The proof of that, my main takeaway of the thing that just happened is that won't happen again. What actually your takeaway is, oh, no, I actually think that probably will happen again. What is wrong with people? Why is everyone like me? Don't be like me. I'm not even going to go. The game is 3 hours from my house. I'm not even going to go now. I know what's going to happen. Saban's going to win. What's the point?
So I do think that people are taking into account the loss of John Mechie, which I think is significant. But I do think another part of this is that people, it feels like, really overreacted to that first game. And they're like, oh, so Georgia's just a total fraud. They aren't good at all. And then they go and beat Michigan by a lot because Georgia's a really good football team, probably one of the 2 best teams in America this year. And people are like, oh, Georgia's back. Like, no, they were that team against Alabama too. It's just that Alabama's also really, really freaking good, right? And so I think that there is almost a sort of an overthinking, I guess, by the general public of that Georgia changed something for that Michigan game, as opposed to Georgia just played Georgia football, and for me, I think that all of this is representative of Georgia, right? I do think that Georgia is somewhat limited against Alabama. I think that Alabama does have advantages even against when Georgia's playing well. I also think that Georgia, again, is much better than Michigan. I think that Georgia would have matched up better with Cincinnati. I think that Georgia would have beaten Notre Dame. I don't know if there's another team in the country that I would have picked Georgia to lose to outside of Alabama, right? I mean, that's it. It just happens that Alabama is really freaking good at football. Spoiler alert, and so I just feel like people are overthinking this idea that, Georgia just had a bad game, but like maybe they're not actually that bad, when I always thought that they were good. I just think Alabama's better.
So has everyone discussed the idea that in 2007, in Nick Saban's first year at Alabama, the very first loss he ever suffered as Alabama's head coach was against Georgia in overtime? Everyone's discussed this, and that from then on, Georgia has cursed itself because Saban has said never again. Saban thought when he got to Alabama, he had a chance to go undefeated his entire career. And then in the fourth game of his career at Alabama, that was ruined in overtime by Matthew Stafford, by the way, who threw the overtime touchdown to win the game for Georgia. And Saban has never lost to Georgia again. That is like, now I just might have made that up. Well, or Nick Saban might have a thing of it's one of those things. You might want to be the second team to beat Saban, but you don't want to be the first team because he's never going to forget you. And his number one goal in life is like, I don't care how many national championships I win. I'm just never losing to Georgia again. Thanks, Matt Stafford. Is that where we are on this? Kirby Smart. If Kirby Smart doesn't realize this, and don't tell him that Saban has cursed Georgia for all eternity because back in 2007, Georgia won. But now, again, I'm talking myself out of what I thought.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what, I don't think that ULM has beaten Nick Saban since they beat him in 2007. So I'm sure he didn't forget, right?
He has the Georgia dartboard in his office and the Louisiana Monroe dartboard in his office. And he's like, never again. Okay. So now I was also, again, originally my discussion of this particular topic related to Georgia was what I feel good about when it relates to Georgia. Now I'm getting to what I'm worried about. Is it okay to still be worried about Stetson Bennett? Or is it like, what are you doing? He's been the dude. Because I will tell you this, the way the Alabama-Cincinnati game unfolded, I almost felt like if Cincinnati had gotten a Stetson Bennett performance out of Desmond Ridder, Cincinnati might have had a chance to win. Because Desmond Ridder just basically didn't do anything against Alabama. He didn't run. I know during the game you were tweeting out, why doesn't this guy run? We had talked about it on the podcast. We think Desmond Ridder's going to run a little bit more, even though that hasn't necessarily been his thing this season. I think he did have at one point, he had a run that matters, here we go, but it never really happened. Felt like, man, maybe Stetson Bennett would have hurt them in the run a little bit more. And then you can go back and find things. As much as it feels like Alabama sort of smothered Cincinnati, running the ball offensively, and then just Cincinnati never got anything going. Again, you can go back and see, there was a guy here. There was a guy there. There wasn't blanket coverage. Again, these Alabama corners, they have health issue at cornerback. They're a little vulnerable. If you've got a deep threat, I think you can throw a little bit on Bama if you're willing to do it. Cincinnati, I don't know if they weren't willing to do it because they didn't think they could block them long enough to make Alec Pierce be a threat in the deep passing game. I think Georgia has a chance to do that. But this guy is going to walk on his way to a national championship, and I'm still going to be like, I don't know if he's good enough, but it's hard for me to get away from if the chips are down and if Georgia's down again and the pressure is on. I just don't know if Stetson Bennett is going to avoid the kind of mistake that hurt him so much against Alabama the first time around. And maybe at this point, I'm just unfair to Stetson Bennett because it's like, what else does the guy need to do? He played very well against Michigan. He did exactly what they needed him to do against Michigan. So maybe I should have a little more faith.
Well, I mean, heading into these games, right? What we talked about, we ranked the four quarterbacks in terms of the quality that we thought they were going to play at. And I think I had Stetson Bennett fourth. I think you might have had him third, maybe fourth too. And we had Bryce Young. I had Bryce Young 1, Desmond Ridder 2. You had Desmond Ridder 1, Bryce Young 2. Stetson Bennett was clearly the most impressive quarterback in the semifinal games, right? He was number 1 by quite a bit. I mean, he outplayed Bryce Young. Desmond Ridder was number 4. I was very upset at his performance, to be quite honest. Well, Caden McNamara also, I mean, J.J. McCarthy came in and played well. Caden McNamara was awful. But, I think I'm at a point with Stetson Bennett where if Georgia loses this game, and I mean, I think that they will, I don't think it's going to be Stetson Bennett's fault. Now, I think the question is more, could he have elevated them more? Could they have gotten more from the quarterback position if JT Daniels or Brock Vandegrift or Carson Beck was in the game, or, if they just did a better job with those guys in terms of development? I mean, I think that's a fair question. But, I mean, I even think you look back at the SEC championship game. Stetson Bennett was not the reason that they lost that game. He could have helped them win in more ways, but I mean, he had a good game. They just asked him to do stuff that he wasn't really prepared to do. He threw the ball 48 times. I don't care. I mean, I don't care if you have Bryce Young back there. That's not a good position to put your quarterback in when you're going against Alabama's defense, when you're supposed to be a play action run team. So I think it's more, like, for me, I'm not worried about Stetson Bennett being the costliest factor, right? Yes, he had a pick 6. That's definitely a big deal. You can't ignore that. But I think that when I look at what happened in the SEC championship game, I'm looking way less at, well, Stetson Bennett played them out of it, and I'm looking way more at, why did Georgia only run for 109 yards on 30 carries? Why did they allow Bryce Young to go for 421 yards and allow 2 explosive touchdowns to Jamison Williams? Those are much bigger deals to me, because I guess that I kind of view this from the perspective of, what should Georgia do? What does a Georgia win look like, right? It looks like Stetson Bennett hitting a couple of those intermediate passes. It looks like Brock Bowers having a good game, but it also looks like Georgia averaging 4.3 yards per carry, right? Like, averaging 3 something isn't good enough. It's just not. Their entire offense is built around the idea that they can get 4 yards per carry. And if they're not going to do that, then yes, it's easy to look to the quarterback to then elevate you past that. But, like, I don't think it's fair to say, well, Stetson Bennett didn't throw for 500 yards and 5 touchdowns, because that's not really how their offense even necessarily works.
Okay, what are you worried about for Bama for this game?
Yeah, for Bama, I'm worried that they're not going to be able to be explosive, because so much of their win over Georgia last time was not just explosive in terms of the actual 55-yard touchdowns. I mean, that's a part of it, but it's the way that being explosive forced Georgia to play them defensively, right? It opened up the box. It forced them to dedicate more help to the outside. And I mean, look, we did see against Cincinnati. Again, Cincinnati's defensive backs are definitively better than Georgia's. Georgia has really good defensive backs. Cincinnati has the best defensive backfield in the country. So I'm not going to say that that's instructive necessarily when it comes to evaluating them. But, one thing that we saw in that Cincinnati game was, they didn't get anything against those corners, like nothing at all against those corners. Everything was, okay, we motioned somebody out to get them matched up on a linebacker. We motioned somebody so we can get them matched up on a safety. I think Arquon Bush was the one who was hobbling a little bit, right? And it just wasn't quite the same. And so I think that's going to be a big thing with Alabama in this game, is how can they create more favorable matchups and how can they stretch the field from that perspective, right? Because there's not obvious switches necessarily on this Georgia defense. I don't think that that's necessarily how it's going to work. You have to just be explosive enough to where they have to dedicate coverage to you, right? Or they get punished for playing man on you. And we know Jamison Williams is and can be that guy. I think that Ja'Cory Brooks showed us a lot in the SEC championship game and really all season long, but it wasn't quite enough. I think that they do need somebody else to step up. Slade Bolden did his thing. Jaleel Billingsley had some big catches. That matters. All that matters. But I feel like for Alabama, it either needs to be Ja'Cory Brooks having a really big game, or they need to even generate another receiver who can maybe be a little explosive for them. So that's the big question for me, because so many of Alabama's opportunities were created by explosive passing in that game. I'm curious whether that's replicable without John Mechie.
So the thing about Saban is that he's such a good coach, but you can't.
What?
So my big thing, my worry about Alabama is how good is Nick Saban? No, I'm just kidding. I was just kidding. Please don't cut that out and show that to him. I was just teasing. Ding Dong podcast host questions greatest coach of all time. Saban's taping that right up on the board. The idea of, as you and I, as we were watching, and a lot of people were tweeting during the Cincinnati-Alabama game of like, Cincinnati can't stop the run. It's going to be a long day. Cincinnati can't stop the run. Cincinnati can't stop the run. And you and I think we're kind of in agreement on the idea of like, well, for Cincinnati, actually, we don't think this is terrible because they clearly can't stop the run, but Brian Robinson isn't ripping off 60-yard runs. He's just getting like 8 yards every carry. But they did get Bama into some third downs at times. And it's like, all right, make them work for it. And then hope that like on third down, somebody slips. Literally, right? Or that somebody just drops a pass that hits him in the hand. Or that Bryce Young throws a ball off somebody's helmet. Or that finally you make a good play and you tackle Brian Robinson. I actually think that it worked for Bama. But I also thought it worked for Cincinnati because Bama scored 27. Cincinnati was within 2 scores for 46 minutes in that game. Bama didn't pull away until the fourth quarter. If Cincinnati had been able to do anything offensively, they would have been in that game. Now, if Cincinnati had done anything offensively, Saban might have said, okay, now tell Jameson to run deep. And then we'll test Kobe Bryant and Sauce Gardner. But they never had to. They never even had to try. So when you look at that and say, I thought it was interesting that Bama beat a team in a semifinal really without using the Heisman Trophy winner or the best deep threat in college football. They just didn't use them, but they didn't use them because they didn't have to. And because that was the matchup that was bad. It's classic Saban. We talked a lot about like, hey, we think Cincinnati, this is a good Cincinnati matchup. Cincinnati's secondary versus Alabama's receivers. And Saban was like, yeah, I agree. It is a good matchup. I'm going to make it irrelevant. It's like, okay, I'm not going to try to win it. I'm not going to try to like diagram it up and find a way to beat Sauce Gardner. I'm just going to make him extraneous. He didn't matter because it was a Brian Robinson game. So what does that mean for this? I think it means like nothing, right? Like it was just Bama chose to do that because it could. And they never activated plan B because Cincinnati never stopped plan A. So I am sort of like uncertain how to take that into account because using Jameson Williams as John Mechie, part of me thinks, hey, that's going to make it harder for Alabama to try to be explosive in this game. But then the other part of me thinks, Shehan, like that Saban was almost like sandbagging a semifinal. So that Georgia, having just played Bama, now would be like, well, what's Bama going to try to do this time? Right? Because they just played a completely opposite game than they did the week before. So I don't know how to take it. My instinct is they'll use Jameson Williams in a different way. Of course, the Mechie absence matters, but that what they did against Cincinnati was just a good matchup for them and a choice, and they'll make a different choice against Georgia.
I think there's something to that, but I mean, just being there, right? You saw Jameson Williams' frustration, right? Like you saw that he was trying to do things, like he was trying to get into the open field. I mean, there was actually a kickoff return where Jameson Williams got the ball and really should have just let it bounce into the end zone. But he was like, I haven't gotten to run all day. I haven't gotten to do anything with the football in my hands. And he was tackled at like the 12-yard line. It was a really bad play for them. Like, I do think that Cincinnati frustrated them, but I think that you are right that like there were decisions that they made that made Jameson Williams' life harder in that game. And I mean, yeah, I do think that in a lot of ways, Nick Saban went into that game. I don't think he went in necessarily with the intention of like, let's hide our game plan for the Georgia game. But I think that he went in thinking like our likeliest path to victory is not playing football the way that we've played football all year. Our likeliest path to victory is trying to physically bully them until they can't anymore. Right now, this is kind of a side thing. It still is unbelievable that Brian Robinson is the only real running back that they use on their roster, right? Like Trey Sanders got into the game for a couple of snaps, but like for an Alabama team to not have depth at running back is crazy. I know that Jace McClellan got hurt earlier this year. That's a big part of it, but it's still crazy, right?
And that's why they have the Georgia Tech, like All-American dude coming in next year at running back, right? Yeah. So it's like,
yes. And then they'll have Chase McClellan back. I think Kamar Wheaton's hurt, another 5-star kid. They'll be fine. I don't weep for Bama, but no. So I do think that there is something to the idea that they're probably going to use players differently. Again, I feel like we need to see. I mean, so for example, the 44-yard Ja'Cory Brooks touchdown, right? Beautifully drawn up play. They use Jameson Williams. They kind of have him run inside. And basically the entire defense is accounting for Jameson Williams because they don't want him to get that sort of mesh play and have space, right? And so, but while that's happening, Ja'Cory Brooks is running a post route and nobody's ready for him, right? It's just the kind of injured safety matched up on him, and that was the play of the game, right? That changed the game.
And he wasn't matched on either of their two best corners. They got the matchup they wanted, yeah.
Right. And that's the defining part of it, arguably. I mean, again, they did not test the corners. They didn't have to, but they couldn't either, right? I mean, they did, and also the other thing too, right, is I kind of mentioned it, but you just saw Alabama come out a lot in that sort of bunches look and sort of forcing linebackers to make decisions in coverage, and they just didn't know what to do, right? And so again, that'll be less of a factor for Georgia, but I do think that getting favorable matchups is going to be a big part of the game, and I do think that. But I do think that whereas against Cincinnati, those decisions were made within the 5-yard line, right? A lot of them were, okay, let's get the switch on this. Let's run this sort of pick play. I think that more against Georgia, it's going to be some of the same, but those decisions are going to be made 15 yards down the field instead, right? It's going to be over the top. It's going to be, running, zag concepts, stuff like that, right? Where you are making players make decisions in space, especially when they're playing zone. But doing it instead of 5 yards from the line of scrimmage, making them do it 15 yards down the field, because I think they're going to keep trying to be explosive.
All right. So where I have some worries about Alabama would be the same thing that we talked about a lot before with Alabama, which is the right side of their offensive line. We've talked about how Chris Owens at right tackle just grades out really poorly this year. And then their right guard, Emil Ikior, got hurt against Cincinnati and came out early. They put in J.C. Latham, a 5-star freshman, into that spot at right guard. And then Chris Owens got hurt late in that game. And when Saban spoke on Monday, he sort of didn't have huge updates. It seems like he's trying to make it sound like maybe those guys would be available. You read the reporting, it feels like maybe Ikior won't be able to get back. But Latham played well in a world where, hey, this is just a bigger Alabama offensive line, and they're just going to lean on guys in the run game and get after it. But I think when you talk about there was already a deficiency at right tackle, now if you take out the right guard, and even if you have backups or young guys there, and now you have a spot where Georgia can try to come after the quarterback a little bit there, I just wonder again what Georgia learned from it. I just think the Georgia defense is just going to be more of a factor, right, in this game. That you said you don't have very many questions about the Georgia defense. They got their mojo back, I think, to a large degree against Michigan. You saw all the things that they've been a problem for teams all year. And then if you just have, you sort of add a little bit of a soft spot to what was already, relatively speaking, for a team like Bama, a soft spot. I just wonder if Georgia will attack that side of the line. And again, for a guy like J.C. Latham, who's going to be a great player, is a great player already, but he just hasn't played much. All right, you got sort of your first major action in a semifinal against a team that was physically overmatched. Now here comes Georgia, and I wonder there if you combine injuries to already what was going on with Owens at right tackle.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think that this kind of gets back also to a question that I have about Georgia, which is how are they going to pressure the quarterback differently, right? I mean, we've talked about Georgia's true edge rusher was suspended from the team, right? He's got an investigation going on. And so they don't have like a true edge rusher. They don't have a Leonard Floyd, right? They don't have a guy like that. And so I think that the way that they choose to attack the pocket is going to really define this game in a lot of ways, because I think that you did see that Georgia didn't really seem to have much of a plan when it came to Bryce Young. They were just kind of like, we'll just keep, playing Georgia football, and we're going to play, very base stuff, and it's going to work because it's worked for us all the rest of the year. Well, it didn't work, right? I mean, they didn't get enough pressure on Bryce Young. They didn't force him to make quick decisions. Yes, part of it is that Bryce Young is one of the best, maybe the best in the country at under pressure, right? Like he's really good. I do want to say that, but you still have to make life a little more difficult for him. And I don't think Georgia did a good job of that. And so I'm curious to see now, heading into this game, what is Georgia's plan to attack that right side of the offensive line? Because again, you mentioned Chris Owens, been real bad. And Majay Sanders for Cincinnati had a great game matched up against Chris Owens as well. I mean, he made himself some money with what he was able to do. He didn't get all the way home to Bryce Young, but I think he was credited with 6 or 7 quarterback hurries in that game, and that feels light, right? And so they need something like that too. They need something like that, Georgia does, to be able to really compete with Alabama in this game. I don't know what that is, though. I don't know who the player is that you're going to shift out. I don't know the player who you're going to have screaming off the edge, unless you are literally looking at Nakobe Dean and Channing Tindall to come to the edge. I just don't know exactly what the plan is.
I do wonder, this to me, and this is the kind of thing where Kirby Smart can get after a little bit, and Dan Lanning, the defensive coordinator, that again, I think this. Can I go back to the thing I said before that sounded good in my head that then you destroyed in 3 minutes? How about this idea that Kirby Smart, I do think there are some things in his history as a head coach that he is, and not that this makes him unusual. If things are going well, he's not going to change. He's not going to rock the boat while it's going well. That's, sort of like not going to Justin Fields a couple years ago, that's staying with Stetson Bennett here. And that if they've been doing kind of their thing defensively, and it's like, all right, well, we're going to play Bryce Young and we're just going to do our thing. And then your thing didn't work anymore. And now if Dan Lanning and Kirby Smart get in the film room and they have a reason to say, well, what's our Bryce Young game plan, right? Because sometimes, the great coaching battle sometimes is, well, what do we want to do that's our strengths versus how do we want to change what we do to attack somebody a different way, to try to go after their weakness or to show them something different. But then I do think Kirby Smart would say, well, then we're playing this well. We're going to do us. And then doing us didn't work. So I do think that could be a thing that I don't know what the answer is. I agree with you. What's the magical, how we're going to affect Bryce Young more? But I think Dan Lanning and Kirby Smart are smart enough to come up with something if they allow themselves to do it. And I think maybe losing 2 games ago, nope, not working again. Is it not working? You're laughing. I went back to the well. I tried another version of it. It's like, oh, the loss is going to let Kirby Smart be a smarter coach? Cool, Doug. Good theory.
The thing is, too, right, and this is why Nick Saban's the greatest coach in the history of football, in addition to being really dang good at recruiting, is that Nick Saban doesn't need permission to make adjustments, right? Nick Saban just does it anyway. So they won the SEC championship game, and after the game, he probably was like, I hated what I saw out there. That was a disaster. I can't believe the pressure that we allowed. I can't believe all this. So he's also going to have a game plan to deal with what Georgia hypothetically could do, right? That's the difference in this game. That's the difference between Nick Saban and everyone else. And again, this is not a Kirby Smart discussion. I think I've been very pro Kirby Smart this whole year, but this is Nick Saban just does it different. That's the thing. You have coaches who are good at X's and O's. You have guys who are good motivators. You have guys who are good recruiters. The thing that makes Saban special is that he does all of those things. And again, does not need situations to create those opportunities for him. He just does it.
I just am imagining Nick Saban leaning into a microphone and saying, Nick Saban doesn't need permission to make adjustments.
Because can you imagine Nick Saban after the SEC championship game, which they won by 17 points, watching film and being like, yeah, let's run it back. Let's do it. That would never happen. That would never, ever happen.
Yeah. Okay. I have to change my pick. I think I have to change my pick for the game. You're making me feel like a crazy person. You and Nick Saban combined are making me doubt everything about my life right now.
He is inevitable.
Nick Saban is inevitable, Nick Saban said. We'll be right back after this. Players to watch for the national championship game on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, Doug and Shehan back. Kind of guys sort of in the crosshairs a little bit. Interesting guys to keep an eye on. I'm going to go Bama corners because Josh Jobe played against Georgia last time, then got hurt, and then is out for the season and did not play against Cincinnati. Kool-Aid McKinstry is still their other guy, and they played Kyrie Jackson at corner most of the game. Graded out pretty well on PFF, but again, Desmond Ridder didn't do anything. But you do wonder, again, it was like, I do think there was some part of that going into the Cincinnati game. It's like, hey, Bama lost one of its best guys on the outside. Can you attack them there a little bit more? And Cincinnati was like, no, thank you. We will not do that. I think maybe Georgia will try to do that. Again, I think George Pickens only had one target against Michigan, probably because they didn't need to target him much more. But it's like the ongoing George Pickens. How much is he going to be back? How much is he going to play? How much is he going to be back? I do wonder if that's, I mean, even at Bama, right, Shehan, when you have a guy who's played all year and now he's not playing, and the guy who hasn't played as much is playing, I think it's reasonable to think, well, that might be something. So I just wonder, those corners, I don't think they're a gaping hole, but is there an opportunity to attack them a little bit more than they did last time out, just because you're replacing probably the guy who's their best corner is no longer there? Is that anything? Do you think those Bama corners are on alert at least a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it goes back. I believe that he was my pick for player to watch before the Michigan game, and that's George Pickens, right? It depends a little bit on whether George Pickens is going to be a big part of the game plan. He was in the SEC championship game. He was not against Michigan. You'd expect that he'd be even a little healthier heading into this game. And you'd also expect that that Georgia maybe held him off a little bit, right? Didn't necessarily show everything against Michigan, especially because he went to 27-3 and that game was over. So I do think that that'll be a big part of it too, right? That, yes, you know, I'll be curious if they test the corners, but it'll also be built around whether they feel like George Pickens is ready to be that guy to test it. Because if it's not George Pickens, then they might just not test him, right? I mean, it might just be play action, run the ball, and Brock Bowers, right? Like it just might be that. But if George Pickens is healthy, I mean, this is a legit NFL receiver. You know, he's going to be drafted not this next year, but the year after that. You know, I think that is potentially something that could swing the game in some ways.
Yeah. Okay. So who is your Bama guy sort of you're keeping your eye on?
Yeah, I'm looking at Ja'Cory Brooks. I think that we saw him have an explosive play against Cincinnati that really, I think, decided the game in a lot of ways. If he doesn't have that 44-yard touchdown pass, again, we talked about it on the Tuesday show. Cincinnati gets the ball back at halftime, after halftime, only down 10-3. It's a totally different ball game than getting the ball down 17-3 out of halftime. Just totally different game. And so I was waiting for Alabama to generate an explosive play with their receivers, right? I mean, after losing John Mechie, and, you know, John Mechie, like you kind of have mentioned, was the setup guy in a lot of ways for Jamison Williams. Well, they let Jamison Williams be the setup guy, and Ja'Cory Brooks took advantage. So I think that that's going to be a huge part of the game, is whether Ja'Cory Brooks can take advantage of being set up in a lot of ways, right? Because they really need that explosive component to their offense. I mean, it's not just because they're playing Georgia. I mean, I think that's a huge part of it, but also just the way that their offense has worked all year. I mean, they've been a very explosive offense. Bryce Young won the Heisman Trophy behind being able to attack downfield in a lot of ways. And so I think that they need Ja'Cory Brooks to have a good game. They need Ja'Cory Brooks to spread out those corners. They need Ja'Cory Brooks to force some safety help. Because the other thing, too, is if Ja'Cory Brooks starts off having a good game, I think that opens up things for Jamison Williams as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's having two guys you believe in instead of one changes a lot on the outside. And if Bryce Young is at that point, that matters a lot. All right, the Georgia guys that I'm looking at are offensive tackles Jamari Sawyer and Warren McClendon. Against Michigan, they basically gave up nothing. Michigan had 5 hurries against Georgia in that game, according to PFF. The game before, Alabama had 11 hurries against Georgia. Now, of course, part of that was because Georgia dropped back to pass so many more times that was part of the issue. So the numbers go up, but that's also part of the point that, like, maybe don't have to go back to pass so much and you'll be okay. Don't put as much on Stetson Bennett. But I think in general, Aiden Hutchinson and David Ojabo were not a factor in that semifinal, really. And I think that I didn't go back and analyze it myself, but other people have, the good film analysts, NFL draft guys. They just said they had a great plan for Hutchinson, that they didn't leave the tackles on an island. They made sure they always had help. They designed their offense around trying to neutralize Aiden Hutchinson, who finished second in the Heisman Trophy voting. And then Ajabo wasn't that great. So they sort of neutralized those two Michigan pass rushers. So now can they do a version of that with Will Anderson? Well, last time out in the SEC championship game, again, 11 hurries for Bama in that game, 5 of them by Will Anderson, right? Hutchinson only had 1. So Will Anderson was a problem in that game. But again, do you learn from, in the end, again, I think there's been a little bit here of like, well, hey, maybe like Will Anderson should have been in New York, which people thought sort of at the moment. And then after the way the semifinals played out, it was like, name the defensive player in the semifinals who went to New York. And it's not Will Anderson, and it is Aiden Hutchinson. And what are you talking about? I do think Will Anderson probably is a little more difficult to game plan for than Aiden Hutchinson possibly. But can they learn from what has happened with them against Will Anderson, with what they did successfully against Aiden Hutchinson? And I just think those tackles are pretty good. So I just think they are. Jamari Sawyer and Warren McClendon are pretty reliable guys. If you get them a little more help situationally, you plan a little bit how you're going to attack, I think you have a chance not to neutralize Anderson and the Bama pass rush to the exact same extent that you did it to Michigan. But I think maybe some of their success against Hutchinson can help them in their game plan against Anderson. And it starts with those 2 tackles who I think played pretty well in the semis.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to go with Trayvon Walker, the defensive end for Georgia. And the reason that I say that is that he had 43 pass rush attempts against Alabama in the SEC championship game, double anybody else. And he only won 4.9% of those. Like, that's terrible. That's not good. I mean, his overall grade in that game as a pass rusher was 53.4 per PFF. Like, he can't be a non-factor. You cannot afford him being a non-factor in this game. I'm not saying that he's going to go in and fix everything, but he had 5 sacks this year. He had 6.5 tackles for loss. He was a big factor in their pass rush, and he kind of is the guy who they hope in a lot of ways, I think, can be that pass rusher. And so if he's going to have these kinds of issues, I mean, that's not good enough, right? Now, granted, a lot of the time he was lined up alongside Evan Neal, and Evan Neal is the one good Alabama offensive lineman. But you have to win more than 4.9% of the time. That's one of the worst rates on the whole team in that game. You need to be winning more 10 to 15% for Alabama, for Georgia to have a chance. You need to be forcing hurries. You need to be getting to the quarterback. You need to be getting hits. I mean, to only to have 43 pass rush snaps and only have 1 pressure, it's just not good enough, or to have 1 hurry rather. So I think that Trayvon Walker needs to step up in a big way. And if Trayvon Walker isn't prepared to step up, Georgia needs to find somebody who is.
I think we're to the picks part here, Shehan. So again, as we said, Georgia is actually favored by 3 in this game. Who knows? Nick Saban may frighten people into Bama being a favorite by the time this game starts, because I think, like, the longer you think about it, it's like, am I really going to go against that? Am I really going to go against Nick Saban? But I just, on the football, I still think there's a lot of football things, especially like with Mechie out, especially with Josh Jobe out, just especially with maybe a little, even more Pickens. We're going to have spent the whole year going like, more George Pickens, more, that I just think there's some football stuff that still looks pretty decent for Georgia. So I was going to say I'm not changing my pick from the beginning of the podcast, but rather than saying with confidence I'm picking Georgia, I'm going to say against my better judgment, I'm picking Georgia. So I will pick Georgia 28-24. And I will just tell you that our texters, the choices I gave for the texters were, are you picking Alabama with confidence, Georgia with confidence, or either of them not sure? In the end, 63% are picking Bama, 36% are picking Georgia, but 76% of the people took not sure, right? So overall, 43% I'll take Bama, but I'm not sure. 33% I'll take Georgia, but I'm not sure. 20% I'll take Bama with confidence. 3%, I'm taking Georgia with confidence. I mean, just given the realities of the world, I don't know how anybody other than, Kirby Smart's family could take Georgia with confidence. How would anyone take anybody with confidence against Nick Saban at this point? I just like some of the football matchups again for Georgia. And I don't know, Bama, was it just strategic? This is how we're going to beat Cincinnati, and then you throw it out? Or was there anything there that without Mechie, the passing game is enough substantially different that it affects how they play? It's probably just a matchup thing, throw it out. But it doesn't completely ease my mind that the loss of Josh Mechie still sort of fundamentally changes how Alabama tries to attack people. So I would be really nervous to give the points. I can't imagine betting hard-earned American cash on Georgia minus anything, but I guess I would take it because I'm taking Georgia by 4.
Yeah, the funny thing about this is you mentioned Alabama opened as a 1-point favorite. So what that says to me is that the model liked Bama, right? That's what it says to me. And instead, it's moved in a Georgia direction, not because of the model, not because of statistics, not because of anything like that, but because the public seems to be loving Georgia. And good luck to you, public. Good luck to you. We mentioned before the Cotton Bowl, right? It's Alabama, Cincinnati. There's a lot of really good football reasons that we think that Cincinnati can compete. And I think almost all of them came to fruition, right? I mean, the funny thing about that game, I think I mentioned to you after the podcast, is that my final score prediction was 27-21. And if Cincinnati converted on those red zone trips, I would have gotten it exactly right. Unfortunately, not how we play football, but I still think I should get some credit for that.
More credit than I would get for actually picking Cincinnati to win, you mean?
Something like that. That was the worst part, is that the game went exactly as I thought, but the line still screwed me because it still ended up being a 21-point game.
I think Cincinnati plus those points was the right bet, because you could not have predicted that Desmond Ridder would be that. Boy, are we making excuses. This whole podcast is one big giant Doug excuse.
I think that you have to evaluate our picks on the spirit of the picks, and I think that the spirit of the picks clearly was in the right direction.
Let me tell you, you don't know how many times I have tried to cash my spirit of the pick betting slip in Vegas and had that thrown back in my face. The team didn't cover, but really, didn't they cover in spirit?
The pathway to them covering hits. Don't you realize this? But no, so all that to say, I mean, I feel like it's somewhat like the conversation we had before the last game where, yes, Georgia has very legitimate football matchups, right? I mean, I don't think Alabama's going to be as explosive as they were in the last game. I don't think anything's going to come easy for them. I don't think they're going to score 31 points in 16 minutes of game time. None of that's going to happen. But I do think, I think sometimes I think of it as being the Bama effect to some extent, but I think it is just the Nick Saban effect, right? It is I know that Nick Saban's going to have a better game plan than Kirby Smart. Again, I'm a Kirby Smart defender. I think that he's a very good coach, but I mean, we saw Nick Saban pants Lane Kiffin this year. We saw Nick Saban pants everybody that he played this year. Sam Pittman. We've seen him do that against Dabo Swinney at times. We've seen him do that against Jimbo Fisher. It does not matter, right? Nick Saban is going to have a better game plan than whoever he's going up against. He just is, despite also having better players. So for me, I see matchups that are favorable, but I just think that it's Alabama. I think that Alabama has a mental advantage, not just based off of what happened in the SEC championship game, but I think just generally there's so much pressure on this dang football game for Georgia to win their first title since 1980, to give Kirby Smart his first championship, all of that stuff, right? So much pressure. And now they're the favorite too, because America just wants Georgia to suffer even more. And for Alabama, this is the freest national championship I think they will ever be able to play, right? No, they weren't supposed to be here. They were early. Nick Saban's basically said as much. And so I think that with a Heisman quarterback, with a first-round NFL receiver in Jameson Williams, with the future 2023 number 1 overall NFL draft pick, Will Anderson, I just think that Alabama is going to play freer. I think that Alabama is going to have a better plan. And while I think that Georgia actually this year has better players than Alabama, I think that Alabama is the team to beat.
So again, an hour of me trying to persuade you that Georgia getting boat raced the first time in this matchup takes pressure off Georgia. Last chance to buy that line of thinking. No,
and you're telling me that I get points to bet on Alabama? Are you kidding me?
You're making me feel like a crazy person. What is again? Seriously, I'm wearing a backwards baseball cap right now, and I haven't showered. I am the face of the public. Like if you were like, it's like who, like the sharps in Vegas are like, all right, we're betting on this. It's like, who are the people taking the Georgia side to make Georgia the favorite in this game? And then like a snapshot of me, like a mugshot pops up on the screen and they're like, that guy. And they're like, no, that makes sense.
The 47-year-old white dude from Ohio just being like, yeah, probably Georgia.
I mean, there's nothing. That loss absolutely persuaded me that they're going to win. That's his thinking. Okay.
He can't keep getting away with this. Continues to get away with it.
So I did ask our tech subscribers, what do you think about this game? Our guy Doug said, we've seen this game. If Alabama wins, they are clear national champs. If Georgia wins without a tiebreaker, I'd say it's a split national champion. And Rose Bowl Ohio State is better than both. We are paying the price for letting Cincy in the playoff. Doug is going hard on that. I do think I don't think anything would have changed probably in the end. This inevitability of Bama's Bama, and I do think Georgia is the best of the non-Bama teams this year. I think it was a matter of when was Bama going to get to the point that being Bama was enough. I said after that Michigan Georgia semifinal that I thought Ohio State would have been a better matchup for Michigan. I do think as wrong as I was in trying to pick Cincinnati, I think you and I were exactly on. And a lot of the public was not. A lot of the sports writers were not. We're on the idea that's a bad matchup for Michigan. And again, I sort of just said Ohio State with that passing game that you saw with Jackson Smith and Jigba and CJ Stroud going nuts in the Rose Bowl. Obviously, Georgia has a better defense than Utah, but somebody who can throw it over the top a little bit is a better matchup for Georgia than a team like Michigan's that's just going to try to run into the teeth of that defense all day. But I think this is probably where we were going to get regardless, because as you know, Georgia, part of what happened with Georgia then too is that their opposite side of the ball played really well in a game like that. And that you do have to give credit to the Georgia offense that they took advantage of things, and that all year there sort of was a discussion of like Georgia defense versus Ohio State offense, but Ohio State's opposite side of the ball never got to the point that Georgia's opposite side of the ball got to. So I do think you have to give Stetson Bennett and Brock Bowers and that offensive line and Todd Monken and the running back rotation a decent amount of credit for much of the time. Because even as you said, I mean, again, Stetson Bennett's numbers in the SEC championship game are pretty good. He just threw some really killer picks, but that's not a deficient offense. Right, the defense is excellent, but the offense is pretty good. See, now I'm talking myself into my Georgia pick again. The offense is pretty good.
Hey, I mean, if there's one thing that I know that Ohio State would have loved to see, it was an even more physical offense. That would have been the solution.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not saying they would have won. I'm saying they would have thrown a couple touchdown passes. That's all.
To quote our boy Ari Wasserman, this game is just proof that Ohio State was the best team in the country this year.
Yeah. Don't quote Ari on this show. I love Ari. So Chuck has said the games are about matchups. Both semifinals were bad matchups for the losers. In the first two games between these two teams, there was a matchup problem. Georgia's awesome in their front second, but their entire secondary from last year got drafted. They pressure the QB so well. Nobody was before them was able to protect the QB and stress the back end. But now with Bama down an elite receiver and down the offensive line, that's something to watch for. I do think that's smart from Chuck that, again, the idea that Georgia's, not that it's bad, but their strength is their front seven. Most people could never test the back end. Bama could, but part of the reason Bama could test that back end is now in doubt in this game. John Mechie on the right side of the offensive line. So I do think that matchup part of it, that is some hope for Georgia, that I do think it's possible that between the offensive line, Mechie and Jobe, like, so part of it is like Bama's just not quite as talented as they were in the first game, just based on a couple guys they lost, which again matters some, but maybe Not enough. All right. So we are going to try to do, we think, a Twitter Spaces event on Saturday night on Twitter. If you follow the College Football Survivor Show account on Twitter, just type that into Twitter, College Football Survivor Show. It'll pop up. I think it's CFB Survivor Show. We'll do an event out of that on Saturday around 7 o'clock. That's our plan, at least. Shehan and I will probably be in there answering some questions. You guys can jump in with us and do that. Yeah, it's just something a little bit new. Try it out. And then at the moment, my plan is I'll be there for the national championship game on Monday, which means that next week when we come back, we'll finish up and sort of reflect on the national championship games and what we learned from this season. And then we're planning to kind of keep this thing rolling. So don't go anywhere. We're going to talk about college football within a playoff context. Our plan is to do that basically year round at the moment, unless they pull the plug on me. And maybe Shehan, one day he'll come back, it'll be just Shehan. And Shehan and a rotating cast of different old guys. And maybe that would be something that they could try.
Where are we going to find more old white guys?
Do you know any old white guys in sports writing? I don't know.
Wow. That's a good question, especially one from Ohio. That's a good question.
I will just, if I'm in the press box of the national championship game, I will just throw out a net and I will just gather up all the old white guys and I will drag them back to my house and we'll just rotate through on the microphone.
Just stand at the end, at one end, put on some Bruce Springsteen and see who turns. That's the easiest way.
You'll be on and you'll be like 17 minutes into the next show and be like, wait, is this not Doug? I can't tell you guys apart. You're all the same.
It's the guy with who hasn't showered with the backwards baseball cap. That's him, right? I don't know.
What is it? Good morning, youths. Welcome back to the College Football Survivor Show with Shehan Jeyarajah and a rotating cast of lame old men. All right, those are our picks. We'll see what happens. Thanks to you guys for being along for the ride this year. I hope it's a game. Because as much as it's like we're at a 4.62 or whatever we were from our tech subscribers who are like, it's an SEC. Like, if it's not competitive, man, that would stink. So
where on the 10-point scale are you heading into this game?
I mean, I would prefer not a rematch. I would prefer not, from the same conference, different geographic stuff. But within that, I'm convinced enough that I think it could go differently, that I'm curious to see it. And it's high level, it's high level athletes. It's highly skilled, highly motivated, highly intelligent football players going at it. So I'm probably like a 7. Like everybody on a scale of 1 to 10, everybody always votes 7. But like, I'll tune in for Nakobe Dean and Jordan Davis and Will Anderson and Jamison Williams and Bryce Young. Like, I'll tune in for that. I'm cool with it. A lot of times, you can find a lot of 10s, I think, because the championship game is often pretty good, even though the semifinals often leave something to be desired. So I'd be a 7. Where would you be?
Yeah, the pros are that these are the two best teams in the country. I don't think that there's that much doubt about that. I think that there's a really great storyline with Georgia having a chance to win their first championship since 1980. I think that matters. I think that the con for me is I don't feel like this was a game that deserved a rematch per se, based off of how the first one went. Like, because again, we talked about it off the top of the show. 9-6 is like, that's crazy, right? It could have gone either direction. But then, I think that 41-24 is a little bit harder to get excited about. And certainly for me, it's not a secret that, yes, I think that the geographical representation sucks a little bit, right? Like, I think that's a little bit disappointing. But there's enough factors on each side that I'm probably about a 5. I think that by the time the game comes, I'll be closer to a 7 because there are legitimate things I think to be excited about with this game. But I really hope, it would back my pick, but I really hope that this isn't just an Alabama blowout, right? That I hope it's not oh my gosh, Georgia is not ready for this moment. And it is clear within the first 2 drives of the game.
If Jamison Williams has 2 long touchdowns early on, I'm packing up my computer at the first Stetson Bennett pick. So I'm done. I'm out.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.